or majalis al-ilm, either in their homes or in famous big mosques, like the Mosque of Baghdad, Masjid Baghdad, Masjid, Damashq al-Jami' al-Amawi, and so on. But then again, most of what I'm talking about today is not about those, because again, this is huge information. Mostly what I'm presenting, yes, thank you, is the Sufiyat, really. Most of the material that I have are for the Sufiyat or the Shaykhat, Sufiyat, who are Sufi scholars and Sufi Shaykhat. And this is what we notice, and I remember the first time more than 20 years, for me, I don't know about other scholars perhaps, but really when I started looking at these sources over 20 years ago, I was amazed by the public visibility of these women all over the place, in Dar al-Islam, in Syria, in Iraq, in Al-Hijaz, in Egypt, in Al-Maghrib, their vocal behavior, their access to mosques and sacred spaces. You read about women shaykhat in the Haram al-Makki and the Haram al-Nabawi, holding gatherings and halaqas. So their public appearance, their public voice, people would come and meet them and ask them questions, other male scholars, other shuyukh, important and significant shuyukh, particularly shuyukh al-Sufiya. They would have mixed halaqas to discuss umur al-maqamat wal-ahwal fi al-tasawwuf, or they would seek a very important shaykha for her dua, or people would overhear. Sometimes I come across details when we overheard Fulana, Sheikha Fulana, around the Kaaba and saying that dua. So again, such details would attract attention, because this means
دي نعملها ايه؟ بتتلزق ولا بتتعمل ازاي؟
In public. Do you need me to stop for a second before someone opens their mic? It's all right. Okay, so make sure that you open. Okay, yeah. Their mobility, their traveling. Ahl Masr sort of invited her to come so that they can benefit from her science, من علمها ومش عارف ايه. So she would travel from Damascus to Cairo, or travel from Cairo to Baghdad, or so it's their mobility and their traveling around. They were spiritual teachers, they were spiritual guides. Excuse me? Yes, of course, and others, by the way. You discover it's not just a Sayyida Nafisa or Rabi al-Adawi. These are icons, right? Sure, icons or symbols, but there are others, tens and hundreds, really. So it's very interesting. That last point about Futuwa, this is also a big story, but I do have to tell it again in the sources. This was something Ahl al-Futuwa, right? This was something that was formed very early on in the 9th or 10th century in Khorasan and in the land of Paris. Not when it originated, Ahl al-Futuwa, they were not warriors or knights. These were originally groups of Sufi sheikhs, Sufi fuqara lillah, who renounced the world and dedicated their lives to helping the poor, helping the distressed, helping women and children, going around in villages and helping people. And soon they were more organized into groups, but they were roaming wonders. They were roaming or wandering groups of Sufi sheikhs, by our standards, who had no job, no regular job, except to go around helping the poor and the children and the women. But so from where did they eat? Where did they make a living? some sources tell us that it seems that's what you get from the sources. In some women sort of established centers along the way or along the travel routes, right? And took it upon themselves as also charity or as participation in helping these groups. They took it upon themselves to prepare food for them for free. Okay, so these groups of 5, 6, 10, I don't know, wandering Sufis, okay, they would come to these centers or to these homes of women, and she would prepare rifq or irfaq or rizq, food or provisions, right? You know, and so what we have in the sources is historians praising these women and considering them as part of Ahl al-Futuwa, because they're part of this whole mechanism, right? And you find descriptions of the historians, فلانة أو الشيخة فلانة كانت من أهل الفتوة أو كانت من أفتى عصرها. First time I read it, I thought that was related to ifta. No, it's not. He's praising her as one of the people of generosity and charity and ethics, and you know, because these Ahl al-Futuwa were known for cultivating moral values and bravery and such. So they were part of that process. So that's sort of an interesting historical thing going there, right? That we discover in the sources. Anyway, so you know, a lot of details and a lot of references. If you're interested in the reference, Taman, there's just no time to say anything, everything. Abdulrahman al-Sulami, for instance, who wrote one of the first of the earlier biographical dictionaries of the Sufiya, Zikr, in the 10th century. يعني it's very early. 10th century, ده يعني 900s, right? Very early on, he began writing Zikr al-Niswa al-Muta'abbidat. And he has another book, and he's the one, by the way, who also wrote a book on Ahl al-Futuwa wal-Muruwa, right? He has a book, unfortunately, that is lost. And this is something that's frustrating sometimes for the researcher. I'm talking about his interest in unearthing women's history in pre-modern Muslim societies. And sometimes manuscripts are lost. We get titles. We get someone referring to a book that collected fiqh rulings by Fulan, by Sheikh. Where is it? It's lost. It's either in Istanbul or even lost in Istanbul, or maybe thrown in Euphrates River by the Tatar. I don't know, but we have a reference and evidence that this work may have existed, or maybe later we're going to discover. One of the books that I wish we had by Sulami, the title of it was Al-Ikhwa wal-Akhawat al-Sufiyya. And this is the first time that I encounter in the title a gender title, you know, Al-Ikhwa wal-Akhawat. Usually there is صفة الصفوة, مش عارف الطبقات الكبرى, and usually that is a whole work. And then the historian would devote either one volume for women's tarajim, for women's, or at the end of every alphabet, or maybe they will have their place in the alphabets. When Zain comes, then it's Zainab or something. This is the first time that I find in this time. Anyway, so a lot of these interesting details that interested me when I first began to look at the significance and interpretation of this, so that we can, and it's like hunting for details, different details, a sentence here, a paragraph there, and a detail here, and then like the puzzle, you know, you put it together, you reconstruct, and that's what medieval historians in general talk about. And we don't always have the full picture or all the details, but we have to deal with what we have, the surviving sources, and use historical imagination, that's what I call it, to reconstruct as much as we can, right? So this is what we have to do when it comes to women's pre-modern history in these societies, right? It seems I will need always help from someone to go to the next slide. I'm sorry. Yeah, so I'll just say next and go to the next slide. I'm sorry. Yes, this is where the exciting part comes. What I told you was simply, looking for stuff, looking for historical material, but that's only half the job, right? Because anyone can, I could tell you the sources and you can go and look for them, yourself, or anyone can do that. The interesting part in what we decided this is going to be women's studies or Muslim women's studies or feminist women's studies, whatever. The interesting part always is how do you take it to the level of analysis and interpretation, right? What theory do you want to use? What methodology? What approach, analytical approach or analytical method you want to use so that you can get something interesting out of the material, right? So what we do, part of what we do is use the feminist lens, the feminist analysis, or the feminist method of looking at this material, and to analyze, okay, why was a particular century or centuries, we have a lot of these women, and then they disappeared after that in the Ottoman history. Did they really disappear in real life? Or is it a problem of historicizing or people writing their history? And the people who wrote their history before, these were all, we don't have a Sophia who wrote her own history, by the way, in her own pen, except, the exceptions, right? It's always male historians, male shiuch, who wrote about them and wrote about them very positively, by the way, very positively. So what does that mean? And let's analyze the voice of the historian himself talking about the women and reporting their words, all right? Let's talk about the presence. How come they were present and then they were not present and then they're back? I mean, what I'm going to do here is just going to open up questions or sort of trajectories of inquiries that can give more research in the future. Let's look at their voice, because we have their reported words and statements and poems sometimes and verses of poems. Verbal text, that's not my term, by the way, that's a term of very important scholar, Mohja Qahf, who said she was trying to answer Layla Ahmed's critique that after a particular time early on, ever since the Sahabiyat or Tabi'iyat, we don't have women in Muslim societies in their own voices saying something or writing something. So so that's bad and it's too bad. And Mohja Qahf wrote brilliant essay to saying, well, that's okay, even if we have these oral, they were oral utterances, oral utterances. Rabbi al-Adawiyya said so and so and so. Shaykha Fulana said so. She once recited this, reported speech. And the idea was, that's okay, even if it's oral and reported and not in an official book by her. That's okay. They are still texts. They are still texts of history, and you can call them verbal texts. The linguists are going to like that, right?
Yeah.
Another thing to analyze, and this is something also fascinating that I may come back to it, the representation by the male narrators himself. سلمي الجوزي بتاع صفة الصفوة الشعراء بتاع حلية الأولياء، I forgot his name, بنسى أساميهم، الشعراني, yeah. In describing Rab'a al-Adawiyya or others, as I told you, there are just hundreds of others. How does he describe her? How does he praise her? تقية ورعة مش عارف إيه وكانت كذا وكان يعني what is the voice of the main narrator himself? That's an interesting part because something will come later about that. we can, I'm just showing you how adopting a feminist lens or a feminist method in analyzing history, you can come out with, things very interesting can come. What are the causes of unequal opportunities and rarity? Why is that question? Why we do not have a lot of first-person women's texts? Why? If they were all over the place, if they had access, as I was saying, to public life and to public teaching, they were praised in the sources as valuable teachers, and people would travel. A sheikh would say, oh, I've heard about Sheikha Shawana or Sheikha Fulana in Nisapur, and I traveled makhsus from Iraq to go and meet her, and I went to her house and I knocked on the door and she opened, and okay, if they were that popular, cultured, educated, why didn't they write something? This is a big question. It's vague. Even feminist historians in the European Middle Ages, something completely different, in the 13th to 14th century, also wonder about that. They have rare women's texts, except by the nuns. That's something, except by the nuns in the convents, because all women were illiterate in Europe in the Middle Ages, with the exception of queens and princesses and nuns. Because in the convent, they would have to learn to read and write, to read the Bible. Okay, so they had access to reading and writing, so and lots of time on their hands. So they would sit and write their memoirs and their spiritual memoirs. So very interesting literature there. The Muslim women, that's my theory sometimes when I think about it, why they didn't write, because they're out there teaching. They were out there traveling. They were out there having retreats in Al-Haram and meeting with people. I don't know, we really don't, but it's a thing to think about. Patriarchy have to do with patriarchal privilege, with certain limitations. Paper was expensive. It really was. Why do you think we have 2 or 3 books? Sometimes there's a book and then on the margin, there's another book, the medieval manuscripts, and then sometimes down there, another book. Paper was expensive, ink was expensive, finding scribes to write for you. So I don't know, maybe all these factors influence. It was difficult to actually produce a book in the Middle Ages. I don't know, something to think about. There are exceptions that eventually you come across. This is something that's very interesting that I just discovered recently. A woman in the 13th century called Ajam bint Nafis, who wrote a commentary on a work by Ibn Arabi, as difficult as Ibn Arabi's texts are, okay? A work that is called Al-Mashahid Al-Qudsiyya fi al-Hudur al-Ilahiyya, something by Ibn Arabi. And she wrote a whole book commentary on it. As you know, this is a very important medieval way of producing knowledge. You write a whole book, kahashiyya, or an explanation, or a commentary with your own explanations and your own interpretation of another book, not just the Quran and the Tafsir. So she did that. She produced a book called Sharh al-Mashahid al-Qudsiyya. I didn't know. So this is very valuable, because I finished telling you that this very rare women's text. Well, this is one of the rare texts, right? And then we have Zahra Langi, who actually got her MA from a few years ago. 2018, 2019, she got her MA from the AUC on Ajam bint Nafis. Wonderful. And she has an article, a very nice article called Ajami Mysteries of Sitta Ajam bint Nafis, a feminine hermeneutic of an heiress of Ibn Arabi. She looked at her text, the text of Ajam, and analyzed her contributions to Ibn Arabi's thought. ده غير بقى أصلاً إنه the introduction, Ajam's introduction, 1 or 2 pages to introduce her book, is interesting في حد ذاتها, because she was illiterate. Could you believe that? طب who was her scribe? احنا قلنا ان scribes that was, even people who are literate would sometimes use a scribe. Her scribe was her husband, whom we know nothing about. We have the name. He doesn't have any books or scholars or something, but she says, and she praises her husband so much. It's really sweet, because she says, oh, I exert a lot of effort on him because sometimes she claims that she was inspired and Ibn Arabi visited her in her dream to tell her, you're the only one who will be able to unlock the mysteries of this book. Nobody understands this book. Come on, nobody understands Ibn Arabi. It's difficult. And you're the only one who will be able to unlock its mysteries. Anyway, so back to, she says, thanks to my husband, sometimes he stays with me for hours and I just dictate to him. And he writes and writes and writes. And sometimes I stop, the inspiration stops, but sometimes it comes to me all of a sudden. And I bring him over in unexpected times and he doesn't complain and he sits and he writes. Isn't that interesting? I don't know. طبعا, this is another point we have in England, another Christian mystic a century later. I'm not suggesting is there any direct influence, but I'm saying it's a comparable case. Marjorie Kemp, this was also a Christian Sufi who was illiterate, and she hired a priest to write her memoirs, which is a whole book. It's the first autobiography in English literature. She dictated it to a priest. So lots of, how much time do I have? Because again, I am the trope of old women's faith. No, I have to say that. Now this is something, and Dr. Ghada already knows about it because I have mentioned it to her. Again, this is something new, just of discovering in anecdotes. By the way, remember when I said that there are formal sources of history and there are informal sources of history that were produced or were written not with the intention of being a historical source. روايات وأخبار that you find it buried somewhere in any book that has nothing to do, but you have these anecdotes. There's a whole debate to what extent do we consider these anecdotes, these stories, real history or not. Later on, I'm going to tell you, in the end, they're cultural products. They are part of Turath, and they are there. They're textual sources, and we can deal with them. What is the story of the old women's faith? And I was telling Dr. Ghada now that I am officially in this stage. So now I'm interested in old women in the Turath and old women's fatawa and old women's fiqh and old women's history. So this is my project in the next few years, inshallah. Imam al-Juwayni in the 11th century, right? A very famous Imam, wrote books on fiqh and whatever. It is said that on his deathbed, there's an anecdote on his deathbed as he was dying, and he was a famous كلامي فيلسوف في علم الكلام وعلم مش عارف. He said that just before dying, he said, لا أشهد لا إله إلا الله وأشهد محمد رسول الله. I revoke all my debates and theological debates on kalam. I don't care about all the studies that I wasted my life in and all the intricate philosophical debates. And I die upon what old women of Nisapur die upon. أموت على ما مات عليه عجائز نسابور. طبعا the city of Nisapur in today's Iran was a cultural center. It was like the Middle Ages of New York of the Middle Ages. Cultural center, very vibrant cultural center. But we have this reference to عجائز نساء نسابور. وطبعا was a center of many Sufis, men and women. محاضرات وحلقات للصبح and then this trope, again, a famous researcher, Sarah Abdul Latif, wrote a very interesting article on following this narrative in the sources. It first appears in the deathbed anecdote of Al-Juwayni, and then it appears, that's what happens in the accumulation of culture. And then it appears in Ihya Ulumuddin by Ghazali, a couple of centuries later or 1 century later. He doesn't talk about Ajaiz Nisabur, but it becomes Iman al-Ajaiz in general. And he was trying to juxtapose between the difficult, intricate philosophical theology and the fitri natural theology or religiosity of old women. And then it appears later in one of in my favorite story of all, with Fakhr al-Razi. Fakhr al-Razi, the famous, again, theological Kalami theologian and exegete and mufassir and everything. And this is very interesting. Okay, I'm taking more time than I should, but I'm going to continue this story. It's my favorite. It's my favorite story. It's my favorite story. It is said that Imam Razi, Fakhr al-Razi, he was traveling and descended on a new town or a new village. And people, oh, Fakhr al-Razi is here, Fakhr al-Razi is here. They all went to receive him and to welcome him. And he was walking down the street surrounded by throngs of people and murids and students wanting to, write every word he says and stuff like that. And then there was this old woman aside and she was looking and she was not interested. And then they asked her, why are you not with all these throngs of people? This is Imam al-Fakhr al-Razi over there. Don't you want to go and see or kiss his hand or something or whatever and get his blessings? And she says, who is Fakhr al-Razi? And they told her, al-Razi is just the most famous philosopher of all. عنده ألف دليل ودليل على وجود الله. They used to engage in these عنده ألف دليل على وجود الله سبحانه وتعالى, theological debates. And this was her comment. لو لم يكن في قلبه شك ما احتاج أن يبحث عن ألف دليل. أفي الله شك. This is part of the verse. And so she completely undermined his whole project. And they reported that to al-Razi, and his response was even more interesting. And he said, Allahumma arzuqni iman al-ajaiz. It's natural, it's fitri, it's uncomplicated, Anyway, there was a whole series of articles after Sarah Abdul Latif's article. She follows the narrative. How does the narrative change from one source to the other? And then others wrote about analyzing that, the trope of the old woman, the old women, old women's faith. And I was just wondering, and I'm thinking with you aloud, is that something that we can pursue, perhaps to talk about ageism? We're trying to relate whatever issues or whatever things in history related to our present issues. Is this relatable to ageism? And what is ageism anyway, right? Just as we first started to talk about sexism or racism, maybe ageism is a thing, I don't know. And then my historian friend tells me there's a category sometimes in fatawa and fiqh just for old women, fatawa makhsus for old women, fiqh ahkam makhsus for old women. And is this good or bad? Because some people analyzed it in that juxtaposition is not in the interest of women because there's the rational, complete philosophical, learned way of discussing religion, and then there's the simple way of women. I don't know. I'm just telling you, and this is something. Okay. Here's by the way, the شرح مشاهد القدسية بتاعت عجم. This was edited and was published sometimes in the 2004 and edited by طبعا دكتورة سعاد الحكيم معروفة. So I have the whole text. This is the whole text and her introduction. You know, something. Type. These are, I may have already, I'm just going to go by the, instead of reading from my text here, because now I have to rush. These are some of the analytical issues to look at this material. This is what I told you about, that sometimes we have a difference between the self-perception of the Sufiya, يعني المرأة الصوفية would present herself in a way, and then there's the perception or the comment of the historian on her story. Right? So sometimes there's a difference. She would present herself in a non-gendered way, and she would recall verses in the Quran or a hadith or Rasulullah or whatever vis-a-vis God, Al-Habib, in a very equal, non-gendered equal manner. The historian's voice are very much gender aware. He really knows that this is a woman. يعني, there is gender awareness. This is something again to analyze. The idea, and then, and why? You know, just ask why. There's no time for one to go into that. I wrote a little bit about that in a 2013 paper. I called it Rings of Memory. Because think about it. Text within text within text. Because this is her reported speech. Excuse me. Documented in the male historian's work, right? And then we come along as the circle, as the third circle, to interpret both, to interpret the male historian's voice and the woman's reported utterance. So it's like concentric, we have text within text within text that we approach, and we compare between the male author's representation and attitude and her own documented words, and the sometimes we have a report of a dialogue between مثلا الشيخة and ذنون المصري and you know, other male shuyukh, and that dialogue in itself is very interesting. And then comes the historian to report that. So there are levels of attitudes towards the idea of gender and sexual difference and sex role, sexual, because sometimes the sheikh would say something, the Luna al-Masri would say, but you're a woman, and she says, well, you're not a true Sufi, because how come you judge people by gender, and we're nafs wahida? So there's always an implicit critique or resistance of normative male, you know, lots of stuff going on. Okay, these are some of the names that worked on women in biographical. I have to mention them. You know, there was no time also to make a bibliography, but for those interested, you can go check people like Asma Afsaruddin, Saadiya Sheikh. She's a professor and a very dear friend from University of Cape Town, and she's written very exciting literature on Sufism and Sufi cultural products. Saadiya Sheikh, Amira Abu Talib recently, Huda Saadi, my friend and my colleague, Asma Saeed or Saeed, I'm not sure, but she has an important book called Women Transmitters of Knowledge in Muslim Society. So I'll have to rush through this. I'm sorry, I'm taking more than I should. Oh yeah, in 5 minutes, مثلا, inshallah. These are, again, as I was preparing for today's presentation and trying to remember what I had written a few years ago, and trying to address the issue of present relevance. Okay, this is a history that there are 10 centuries between us and this history that we're talking about. How can that be relevant other than it's an academic academic work? How can this be relevant to us? We are Muslim women living in the present time, right? This issue, by the way, I benefited from that debate that went on in another context, again, in the context of studying medieval women in Europe, right? No relation to us. But they also raised this issue, because feminist historians, when they first approached that history, also came across, how can this be beneficial to us European women now, or European feminists now in the 20th century, right? So I benefited a lot from that scholarly debate about the value of women's history. Do we regard it? And then they came up with these critical terms. Do we adopt pastism? Pastism in Khalas, it belongs to history, should be put in a museum, has no relation to us. It's just an item of curiosity. And other critics, you have some of the names here: Juanita Rice, Elizabeth Dreyer, Diane Watt, Graham McCann. يعني عملوا شغل رائع. And other people said that, no, we can study that history in its context. We're not going to distort it or anything, because purists, historians are purists. I mean, don't mess with history. Yes. In the sense, don't project feminist theory, don't project race critical theory, it's just as it is. Purists, they call them, pastists, right? Don't appropriate history. But then other critics said, no, we can approach history using presentism. They came up with, they coined that critical debate in how is this history relevant to us? In what are the continuities? And even if there are no continuities, the idea of continuities and ruptures. But why? Why there are continuities here and ruptures there? No, we can, and we can adopt something like دي برضو عجبتني قوي, because it's very relevant to the feminist lens and to how we can relate that history to us, and how we can make that history a mirror where we can see perhaps the condition of present Muslim women in present Muslim societies in the 20th and in the 21st centuries through that mirror, through that reflection, right? And practice constructive, compassionate criticism, right? And we have to, feminist historians said, now we have to comment on that history, or else it's not just إنه preserve it collected in volumes وخلاص ربع العدوية. We have to analyze and interpret. We have to get our Muslim voice now بقى. احنا اتكلمنا إنه these are Muslim women's voices in history. Now, where are the women's scholars and academics, Muslim women's voices? Or else, حتى one critic said, if we don't do that, if we don't interpret history and generate knowledge about interpreting history, then we're just reproducing masculinist textual culture. And I don't add anything, I don't contribute. Anyway, so lots can be done, framing and reinscribing women's, we talked about that. No, I mean, how is that good for me now? I find it, and this is a validation of historical agency of Muslim women. Gives me confidence, it gives me self-empowerment, not just in our foremothers, but in Islamic knowledge, in Islamic Turas. It gives me confidence in the value of the cultural history of Islamic knowledge, right? There are all sorts of very contemporary issues that we can still raise and think about how that interacts. I was talking about continuities and ruptures. The thing about gender roles. Were there gender roles at the time? Were there stereotypes about women's nature and men's nature? Discourses of power? All these are modern theories, but we can still use them to look at that history. to discover in gender roles are not stable, are not natural. They were constructed, and the Middle Ages was different from the Renaissance, different from the Reformation, different from modernity. The influence of modernist, Western modernist constructions of gender ideology. There's a whole story about the influence of the Industrial Revolution in Europe on the establishment of the gender ideology and the domesticity cult, by the way. And again, this is all Western, all European and American. It was a movement, it's not a domesticity cult. But Hagadi was constructed. And there are a lot of historical modernist influences on that, on the idea of the inherent feminine nature. And the problem comes for us when we think sometimes in these gender concepts are authentically Islamic. This is where the problem for me comes, because so history, and later on with there will be time for that. I can just end make it all about history. So history can help us. The plan was to to go to the field of Quranic interpretive tradition. This is something that I have been working on, which is just as we were examining history sources, at one point I still am interested in exegetical discourses, خطابات المفسرين, interpreting the verses, because the verse is something, the Quran itself is something, the fiqh is something, the tafsir is something else. I don't have a legal training, so I cannot deal with fiqh. Fiqh is complex and legal. You have to study law to be able to see how gender was formed, what I call gender formation in the fiqh. But tafsir I have been working on, I have been reading and analyzing discourse analysis. Just sometimes applying discourse analysis to compare the difference between exegetes explain verses differently. And طبعا in everything, thousands of issues in the Quran, but particularly gender verses. What the discourse that Tabari used early on is different from Al-Razi, is different from Zamakhshari, is different from Ibn Kathir, is different from Muhammad Abdu, is different from Twali Sha'rawi, from Amr Khalid. These are all male discourses, and you can analyze them and examine them. So, there are many developments in women's scholarship in Quranic studies. This is have become a huge field now. Whether women scholars who are graduates of Islamic Studies department in Europe and in the USA, and women now, we cannot call, because طبعا people from the religious establishment, I don't want to call them mufassirat, although they started calling themselves, because they've learned the field and they've learned the field. But there's a huge corpus of publications now, mostly in English, للأسف الشديد, a little bit in French, about Quran scholarship from different areas and different angles, really learned scholarship. It's not just I'm a feminist, that was the early stage. Feminists would go in in the shoes, and this is the only thing that we can talk about. No, women scholars now have finished these issues and began to open up to more themes and issues in the Quran, and be able to use their learning and use their perspective, perhaps as women Muslims, why not? And use their perspective to talk about ethics, to talk about ethical worldview of the Quran, to talk about different themes, the environment, narratives, to analyze the Prophet's narrative. There are books about that, but I couldn't get them all in a bibliography. But this is something is very interesting. An American Muslim scholar called Jerusha Lamperty came up with this term that I just love. And I wish I came up with that, but she beat me to it. A term called Muslima theology. She writes in the US, and she has books. Muslima theology, and how we begin to develop and construct a theology, يعني دراسات دينية, from the perspective of a Muslim. And so she sort of coined that term and began to mainstream it in Western academy مثلا. So very interesting. طبعا women as Sadia Sheikh, very remarkable women scholars on Sufi feminist research and recovering the spirituality of Sufism from a women's perspective. My dear friend Naveen Rida, the whole school that looks at the Quran, at the coherence of the Quran, and there's an emerging, an evolving field now called Surah-centric studies. Naveen Rida has a great book on Surah Al-Baqarah, which is analyzing a structuralist analysis of Surah Al-Baqarah. It's a big story. The last thing that is also happening in women's scholarship on Quran studies is the intersections with two other fields, decolonial studies and liberation theology. But there will be no time to go into that. Khalas, conclusion, whether it's history, whether it is some religious literature, we can study them as cultural productions. We can generate from there, as you can see from the analysis and the interpretation, we can generate more knowledge on women and gender from these texts. They're very rich, very rich. But I warn against the polarity of when you approach the Torah from a women's perspective or feminist perspective of these two extreme positions. Me and my friends, we always say that. We don't want to romanticize and idealize the tradition. You approach it critically. Critically and respectfully. The tradition. This is a civilizational past, the Torah. It's okay to be critical of the patriarchy, yes. طبعا في, of course, of the misogyny, of the مش عارف ايه, whatever historical phenomena that were, it's all right to approach it critically. So we don't romanticize, we don't idealize, but at the same time we don't to undermine and we don't to be completely dismissive of the tradition. It has no value and it's all bad and let's start anew. No, this is not my position. We're critical because we're also constructive. You critique, you deconstruct what you need to deconstruct, but you also have the reconstruction because you don't want to destroy. That's not the goal. You want to reconstruct a better alternative or to build upon what. Okay, this is just one last quotation by a medieval critic. I like this quotation, who was also addressing the value of looking at medieval texts. Long time ago, طبعا استفيد ايه, خلاص it's over and done with. And he was saying that no, it has an influence. It can be transformed. The study of the past can be transformative of the present. To be ourselves produced by these medieval texts as we traverse two historical distances, going and coming back. Okay, you go to the history, it will change you, it will transform you. You're coming back, you're cutting two-way journey, and you'll not be the same when you come back. You will be transformed, and this is the whole idea and the whole process of being critical, analytical, interpretive, generating more knowledge that can be related to the present about the past. Thank you very much for listening, and I do apologize for taking much. I don't even know. I probably spent a whole hour. That was not the plan, but thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Umayma. It was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. And let's just like see if
We need
anyone-
the next panel, I think.
I think we could just like have a few minutes for the discussion.
Okay, sure, sure. But I know there are other speakers, I mean, the rest of the panel. Okay, sure, yeah. To document,
Yeah.
when we're talking about history,
Okay.
it's documented
Thank you so much.
for the year 3000 or something. شكرا
Thank you so much.
شكرا دكتورة. شكرا. I hope it was يعني worth your while.
مش عايزة أقول لك how grateful we are.
حبيبتي.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Your presentation, the presentation. ممكن Thank you so much, Dr. Umayma, for an amazing presentation. And now just a minute to get us set. And we will start with the second presentation in a row, which is Associate Professor Dr. Amin Youssef.
I was thinking about the summer and football celebrities and cartoon. And I think this might come as a clashing of frames, yani from early religious women to football and cartoons. This is part of my study, and I'm very grateful to be here today amongst you. Grateful for the live audience here and for the online audience as well. Thank you. I'll try to limit myself to 20 minutes. I've already used 1 minute. This is a study on recursive visual intertextuality that gives a novel conceptual blending analysis of cartoons glorifying football celebrities. And I'm Amani Youssef from Helwan University. Okay. So it seems that, okay. All right. What I'm studying is this, basically what you see in the 2 cartoons. We have recurrence of visual or compositional themes in pairs or sets of cartoons, resulting in the sharing of a common source frame or abstract schemata. So what do the 2 cartoons remind you of? Superman, yes. So based on just compositional similarity, you can remember the Superman conceptual frame. So Superman, Christopher Reeve in the movie of the 1978 is your quoted text. And the 2 cartoons are the intertextual collection. What I'm trying to show you today is that if you apply more scrutiny to the images, you'll see some accentuations. On the left, you have 2 costumes for the sports shirts for 2 teams. And on the right, you have Muhammad Salah with the Superman suit. So, and of course, you would examine the background and you'll see the flags for Barcelona, and you see the flags from Liverpool on the right. So there is here some form of alteration or accentuation. And I argue that such accentuations are ideological. The sports cartoonists have such rich knowledge of events in football.
I'm just checking.
Okay, all right. So they try to add layers of meaning through such alterations or accentuations. The second thing that I would like you to observe today and maybe be convinced with is that in the presence of the intertextual collection, when you see both cartoons juxtaposed in such fashion, your mind is actually constructing not just 2 independent conceptual integration networks, but you are constructing just 1. And your eyes are comparing the 2 cartoons all the time and actually comparing them against the one in the middle, which is the quoted text. So going in your mind is the formation of a single contrastive conceptual integration network. This is my argument. Okay. So I will try to keep the technical details to a minimum, but to a respectable minimum. Yeah. And then we'll try to appreciate the details of the alterations that the cartoonists creatively created. creatively creative. This is very eloquent. Okay. I'm not sure which one is being shown. This one? Okay. So I should be looking there. So I have two objectives, and I was just expressing them, showing the accentuations and showing the composite or contrastive integration network. Keeping the outline to just the simple four, show you a bit of the data, conceptual integration blending. This is the second component here is the theoretical background, but I'm keeping it light as well. There is a bit of analysis and the conclusions. My data, all of it was, although I searched the internet and I downloaded maybe more than 200 cartoons, but the ones I analyzed were just 5 pairs of cartoons, and I found them to represent all the types that I needed to show in terms of conceptual integration networks. The two cartoons, yes.
Need to make sure that this is the one being
this
shared.
is the one that's being shared. That one is not
That's-
moving. Yeah.
Yes, go for it. This one here.
Okay.
Okay, so now is this the one that's being shared? Okay.
Okay, it was the earlier one?
Yes.
Okay. So sorry for the online audience. We were showing the still image. Sorry. Okay. So the 5 cartoons are on Mohamed Salah or Mo Salah, Egyptian forward of Premier League Liverpool and Egypt's national team, and also on Lionel Messi, the Argentinian forward and captain of Spanish Barcelona. And this year he moved, but at the time that I started my study, he was still with Barcelona. Conceptual blending is a general cognitive model for meaning making and for how novel concepts emerge. Conceptual blending is a mental operation that operates largely behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, meaning that you're not conscious about it. It is in your subconscious. It's like what we did at the very beginning when you were looking at the cartoons and your eyes were just going from one to the other, and also through the quoted text. So the operation that was going on in your mind was behind the scenes, characterized as being just on the surface, a simple one, because it's just the movement of the eyes, but underneath that, it's very complex. It has this hidden complexity. And it is represented by a vast variety of integration networks that also appear simple on the surface. Okay, are we, it is not moving, this one as well. Okay. Okay, it's working. All right. Integration networks involve partial matching between 2 or more input mental spaces. Their structure can be partially projected to a novel blended mental space that develops an emergent structure. Mental spaces are built up dynamically in working memory. So you were doing that in your working memory, your present memory, but a mental space can become entrenched in long-term memory. While you were looking at the cartoons, you were also recalling well-established frames, the frames that would come to your mind when we mention the name of Mo Salah or Messi. You will think of football, you will think of professional play, you will think of teams, you will think of competition, goals, and historical events in football, and so on. So what are mental spaces? They are small conceptual packets constructed as we think and talk for purposes of local understanding and action. Mental spaces are connected to long-term schematic knowledge called frames. This is an image of the very basic conceptual integration network. The circles represent the mental spaces. The solid lines across indicate the matching and cross-space mapping between the input mental spaces, and the dotted lines indicate connections between input spaces and either generic or blended spaces. The solid square in the blend, so we'll be focusing on the one at the bottom here. Okay, it stands for the emergent structure, and that's the meaning that you get out of watching both cartoons in an intertextual set. The basic model represents a conceptual integration network with a minimum of 4 mental spaces, 2 input spaces, the ones on the right and left, a generic space, that's the one up, and a blended space. The blend, which inherits partial selective structure from the input spaces and dynamically develops emergent structure. Now, while building the emergent structure, our mind is capable of applying certain operations. The first one is a simple one of composition. The emergent structure or meaning is composition in the sense that it would not be available in any of its constitutive input spaces. Like when you were looking at the cartoons, your mind drifted to maybe the accentuations. You start composing new meanings that are not already available in your well-established frames. Background knowledge. So if you know a bit about football, this would enable your mind to do the following operation, which is completion. You complete the gaps necessary to interpret the cartoon. If you knew about certain conflicts, about signing contracts, and you see the player getting rid of one team and being ready to reveal the other team underneath, then this means that there is some move over the horizon. So background knowledge in completion or discourse context may be necessary to understand the blend, which is a process of completion. The recipient, that's the third and the highest operation of them. The recipient or the viewer may run the blend by creatively imagining further extensions to the emergent meaning through different manipulations. We have 4 types of integration networks. I will take you to the first example. I will not bother you with the theoretical explanation of the difference between them. We're going back to the cartoons we were looking at the beginning. And the first thing that we can technically say about them is that we have compression of identity. Now you're thinking of either player as Superman. So there is compression of identity between each player and the Superman character, which motivates a double scope network. This is a complex type of integration networks, where the 2 input spaces, footballer and Superman, equally contribute to the blend. And there are some clashes between them because in terms of action, Superman does a certain type of action while the footballers do a different type of action, and you can elaborate on and on about the different clashes that might emerge. In terms of costumes, Superman rips open a regular shirt that he wears over Superman's suit, hence from in to out. Superman's suit would be costume 1. The one underneath would be called costume 1, while the regular shirt would be called costume 2. For Messi, costume 1 is his native club Argentina's shirt, while costume 2 is his hiring club Barcelona's shirt. Hence, Messi's native club shirt is mapped to Superman's suit. So this is a process of elaboration. You elaborate. Then for him, this is kind of Superman's suit, the one that gives him power. Okay. While his hiring club shirt to Superman's external regular shirt, the one that he gets rid of to exercise power. Hence, through a process of elaboration, higher, more positive evaluation of Messi's native club emerges in the blend. All right. Let's observe the mapping here.
I want to make sure that there is sound. Is there a problem with the sound?
طيب أنا هقعد دقيقتين بقى كمان عشان انتوا كده. Okay. طيب observe the mapping while we are doing this, please. يعني let's buy some time.
Can you hear clearly? People of the Zoom, please. Can you hear clearly?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Now, if you are knowledgeable about football events, you'll know from background knowledge that during the summer of 2020, Messi was stalling renewal of his contract with Barcelona, which raised rumors he might be going back to Argentina. However, Messi later admitted he was forced to stay with Barcelona against his wish until January of 2021 because of a handsome release clause. Okay. So he was forced because he had to pay back 700 million euros. So in a sense, he was there, but he didn't want to be there. So this is why he was ripping the shirt in order to set himself free. Messi's challenging situation with the two teams is mapped to Superman's challenge of leading a double life as Clark Kent, journalist, and as Superman. The blend additionally recruits the frame of Messi's wish to be set free from Barcelona and to return to Argentina, his native club. If you apply the same logic, now I can't flip. Okay, flipped. Sorry. Okay. If you apply the same sequencing of the costumes for Salah, the graphic design of featuring Salah makes no reference to his native club, the Egyptian national team. However, in analogy with Messi's representation, we may. So now we are using Messi's cartoon as a pretext for Salah. So to interpret Salah, you're looking at the quoted text and also for Messi's text. So we have a process of elaboration here where we consider mapping Superman's suit to Salah's native club shirt. In addition, that's the Egyptian national team. Superman's dilemma of leading a double life may be mapped to Salah's performance with the ENT versus his performance with Liverpool, and that was in the news for quite some time. However, a hypothetical analogous frame containing higher evaluation of the ENT and Salah's wish to be free from Liverpool and return to the ENT contradicts background knowledge of Salah's conflict with the ENT. Hence, the mapping remains unfulfilled in this case. So your mind might actually go to places where it has to actually find certain contradictions, so it wouldn't. In the two networks, we have seen so far the two input spaces clash in terms of action, but cross-space mapping links Salah and Messi with Superman, the ripping of the shirt to reveal inner power with the show of great skill and talent in football, and the cheering Superman crowds with the cheering football fans. The two networks depart in terms of costumes and challenges, leading to two different situations. If we had the same situation, if in history Salah was quoted as giving more value to playing for Egypt, then we would have constructed an integration network with one blended space. But in this case, because we have a narrative shift, we have two different scenarios. So we have one integration network, but two blended spaces, one for each player. In the emergent structure in Salah, as Superman, he rips the hiring club shirt to reveal his extraordinary talent and skill, not to express a wish to go back to the national team. That's different from Messi's case, where we have the ripping of the shirt. He rips the less valued hiring club shirt and wishes to be free from hiring club and return to more valued native club shirt. And in Messi's case, we have the native club fans cheering him. But in Salah's case, the hiring club fans cheering him. So in this case, we have richer emergent structure for Messi than for Salah. I realize that time is running, so I will, for the second example, I will just highlight, I will not go into much detail. I will just show you the quoted text first. Remember this one? This is the circle of life scene from which animation? Okay, The Lion King. Who hasn't seen The Lion King? I don't think. Yeah, okay. Okay. So, so these are just enactment of the same scene. But what I want you to observe here is the missing parents for Salah's cartoon. You see that? So this gap was ideological, actually, because for Messi, he has Maradona and he has Pelé, and he was often compared to both icons, and they were helping and guiding him. But for Salah, we have no guidance. So the cartoonists wanted to tell you that he is a self-made star. So in this case, this is a richer cartoon because it has some ideological accentuation to it. And also we have more enemies. We have two instead of one opponent. We have Ronaldo, and we have let's see, yes. So, all right. Okay, and I'm trying to wrap up. So here we have one of the very simple networks. It's a simplex network where you have one input space having the roles and the other input space having the fillers. So this is like in the father role, we have Maradona and Mufasa. And in the mother role, we have Pele. That's being matched with Sarabi. That's her name in the animation. And the baby is Messi, matched with Simba. Okay. So it's a family relation network. Okay. For Salah, do you see the gaps for the father and the mother? Okay. Type the integration, the unified network that we have is not of the same type. Yani, you saw in the first example, we have double scopes, two independent double scopes, generating one contrastive double scope. But here, the two simplex double scopes, because of this ideological accentuation, the gap here, motivates this, the cause effect. This is a mirror integration network, giving two contrastive situations here or scenarios. In one, you have support, and you are being supported by ancestors, in Messi's case. So the expected result is success. In the other case, you have Salah, no mentors and more rivals. So the expected result is failure. But actually, what happens is that there is success, counterfactually. Okay, so this is the integration network that I think you have constructed in your mind. Okay. There are other cartoons like Worship Kings. So there is a lot of glorification, and these are my conclusions. That contrastive networks would allow simultaneous encoding of pairs of parallel cartoons of narrative shifting types, leading to double blended spaces. Cartoonists have manipulated mainly visual intertextuality and compression of identity in creating rich conceptual blends where the two players were idolized and glorified at times to the point of worship. Celebrity glorification or worship was manifested in the cartoons under study as a phenomenon that transcended the particular cultures and surfaced as part of a globalized culture, because Superman is a globalized figure, and also the circle of life scene is quite globalized. The quoted themes were almost predominantly related to a globalized Western culture. Accentuations or alterations of quoted texts are believed to reflect the cartoonist's role in directing the audience's ideology. I thank you, and I hope that was
ladies and gentlemen on the Zoom, I'm going to start the break now. We're going to give the certificate, of course, for Dr. Amani for her valuable presentation. And we have like 20 minutes for the break, and then we'll resume afterwards for grade 3 presentations. We have Dr. Zainab El-Mansi from the BUE, Dr. May Sarag from the BUE, we have Federico Pozzilli, and we have Ahmed El-Ghadamfer as well. Thank you so much. And of course, Professor Dina Al-Dakhs and Professor Mirfat. They are giving us the last joint presentation. Thank you so much. So we break for 20 minutes and then we come back. Thank you. Share and